is getting our local towns to be prepared for sheltering. It's one of those kind of things you can put a lot of money and time and resources into, and then open it up to the community. And then during a storm, maybe have less than 10 people show up to a shelter with or without pets. So it's one that is certainly a challenge from the emergency management perspective. This is a picture of a Red Cross shelter during Hurricane Harvey. And it's not exactly what our shelters look like here in Maine. So again, kind of balancing the need with planning for one. But as we mentioned at the beginning, when we sit, whether you're an emergency manager or a related field, and you say, what are the hazards? And you list things like hurricanes, tornadoes, power outages. You would potentially need a shelter for those things. Us in this field know that storms are on the rise. They're increasing in frequency and intensity. In Maine specifically, we have vulnerable populations, as many states do. Here, in particular, an older population. And then whether or not we want to shelter or we feel like it's worth our time or the greatest bang for our buck. I know there's several competing priorities in this type of work. At the end of the day, it's the law. If you live in Maine, Title 37B governs most of our emergency management activities. If you live in a different state, you probably have your own state, local, and federal laws. But we are required to provide emergency services, and sheltering during an emergency would fall under that. Next slide. But what about pets? So, speaking of laws, folks may remember Hurricane Sandy, excuse me, gosh, Hurricane Katrina back in 2005. And there were many, many lessons learned from Katrina and acts that followed federally for changing the way that we manage disasters. And one thing that came out of it was the PETS Act, so the Pets Evacuation and Transportation Standards Act. Which basically you can read it if you want. There's a lot of jargon that some of it's easy to read, some of it's a little bit more convoluted and or vague. But the long and the short of the Pets Act is basically that emergency sheltering has to be, if you're providing emergency sheltering, that there has to be provisions made for people's pets. Next slide. So feel free to throw this in the chat or unmute if you'd like. But based on kind of what we found during Hurricane Katrina, one thing that came out of this was we found that some of the folks that did not evacuate, and there were many, made the decision not to evacuate during Hurricane Katrina because their pets were not either allowed to come, they weren't allowed on transportation, there weren't shelters. So curious what you all think of the people who did not evacuate during Hurricane Katrina. What do you think the percentage of people did that based on their pets? Any guesses? Right. Seeing a couple 44s. Yep. 37. Okay. All right. Wow, you guys are good here. You're quick. Go ahead and go to the next slide. I'm seeing everybody's got their heart set on 44. It looks like that may be the winner. And you would be correct. So just about half of the folks that did not leave during Hurricane Katrina made that decision solely on the fact that there were not provisions in place for their pets. Next slide. So when we talk about shelters, human shelters, we kind of differentiate between human and pet. There's three kind of major types of shelters. So there's sheltering in place. So rather than leaving or going to a shelter, you stay at home and you either stay home with supplies or a plan that you made, but you're not evacuating your home. You're choosing to stay. There's also non-congregate shelters. So just as kind of it sounds like you're not congregating. So those would be either individual rooms at a hotel, dorms may be set up, but individual spaces for folks. And then finally, congregate shelters. So there's emergency shelters, which usually provides overnight spaces for folks, cooling and warming centers. That's a lot of what we see here in Maine, where local agencies will open a place during the day. Folks can come in, charge electronics, grab a snack, maybe a cold drink right now if they opened one if it was hot, but they're not planning on staying overnight like in this photo. And then finally, temporary evacuation centers. So if people are evacuating, they have a long ways to drive. There may be sites set up similar to the cooling and warming centers where people can stop along the way. Next slide. And then when we talk about emergency shelters, there's also three types. So we have standalone, co-located, and cohabitated. Next slide. And they all have pros and cons. So we'll go through each of these. So standalone shelter is basically a shelter where animals are housed without their owners. So you can see this is a shelter I worked at a number of years ago following the Joplin tornado. That was a pet shelter. There were no humans. It was separate from the human shelter. So a couple of situations where you might use a standalone shelter would be if there's no human shelter open. If an incident impacts only animals, let's say there was a large scale cruelty case, or if you have a number of strays where they don't have owners to take care of them, or humans are sheltered at the same time but in a separate location. So those would be different types of situations where that would happen. And some pros of standalone shelters, you have more control over protocols and procedures because you're using trained personnel. So you can kind of manage that a little bit better. It's more efficient. You can house more animals. You don't have to worry about humans, cots, families. And there's less traffic and potentially fewer security issues because you're not having owners come in and out of the building. It's just the pets and the shelter workers. On the flip side of that, though, there's cons. So a benefit of having humans and pets located at the same shelter is that humans can come in and take care of their pets. They can connect with their pets. They can help clean. They can walk their dog. They can feed their cat. So you're not requiring as much staff in those situations. So this would require a larger number of staff. Additional space is needed. Sometimes there's more paperwork, of course, because if you don't have an owner on site, you want to be thorough with paperwork for that. And then potentially discharge challenges. So if you have stray animals or animals that need to be discharged and they're not going home to an owner, if you're standing up a temporary emergency shelter, most likely you're not an adoption agency. There are cases where that may be the case, but generally it's a separate organization. So you'd have to work with somebody who is to work on different discharge. Next slide. Then there's co-located shelters. So you can see here, this is a picture from Hurricane Harvey. Animals are housed in the same area as their humans. So can be in the same building, but in a different room. Maybe they're in the same property, but in separate but close by buildings. Basically in the same area, but not in the exact same room. So kind of different rooms, same building. And this would be, we see a lot of this here in Maine. So kind of like we said, one of the most common shelters in Maine is having a warming and cooling center. And then if you were opening a pet shelter, usually adjacent or part of the human shelter is what we would see here in Maine and in most temporary emergency animal shelters. So I mentioned this a little bit just a few minutes ago, but some pros, you got owners coming in so they can provide the daily care for the pets. It's a somewhat controlled environment where you would use either wristbands or sign in or both for owners to come visit so you can somewhat control it. And it can be beneficial for a family to have a purpose. That's, kind of easy to say. I come from a shelter background. So for me, it's like you go in, you do the job, and that's that. But you figure if your family's just been through a disaster, you've potentially lost your home, and you're sitting in a shelter all day in a gymnasium somewhere, there's, things are not, it's not always a good situation. So for a family to have a small job to go take care of their dog can really have significant mental health benefits. And then again, kind of mentioned the cons as well, just more traffic, more people, more things to manage, disease transmission just with people coming and going. So all things to consider. Next slide. And then finally, there's cohabitated shelters. So very similar to a co-located shelter, except animals are housed in the exact same area as their owners. So potentially right next to their cot or in the same room. They might have a crate next to the cot, excuse me. And this would be used in the same situation as when a human shelter is open in the community. The only difference is rather than being down the hall or across the yard, you're right housed together in the same area. Some pros to this, you really don't need a lot of staff if you're not setting up a completely separate animal shelter area. The owners can just stay with their pets. So there's not as much need for resources. You may be providing some ancillary supplies if owners didn't bring it. And it really, obviously, the human animal bond, if you're able to be right there with your pet, like you are at home, that's increased. Some cons. I find this to be a very stressful situation personally. Again, coming from a shelter background where it's just the workers and animals, it can be very noisy. There's movement. There's potentially kids running around. There's shelter staff. There's residents, and that can be a very stressful situation for humans and especially pets. The pets might not have as big of an area. You might have dogs and cats next to each other. Complaints from non pet carrying residents, and it can be harder to manage and keep track. So there's no right or wrong answer with any of these types of shelters. There's pros and cons to all of them. It's um, up to whoever's running the shelter to kind of make the determination which one's better. Next slide. All right, so we're going to talk about some planning. And I made this presentation to have it be, this is kind of pie in the sky. So if you're following everything in this presentation, you are doing A plus, you are doing everything by the book and right. If you are doing half of what we learned today, you're also doing really well. And if you're doing just a small percentage, I'd say that's perfectly fine too. There's a lot of animal sheltering, or a lot to animal sheltering and human sheltering. So we're going to quickly touch on a lot of stuff. So some of this will be stuff that you would actually use during an emergency shelter, and some of this stuff is nice to have, and I'll differentiate between the two. So as you're planning, the first thing you're going to want to think of, we talked about, when you think of disasters, the first thing you say is, what are the hazards and what's our risk? So with this, the first thing is, who's responsible? Is it the emergency management agency? Is it the CART team? Is it a local shelter, an animal shelter? Are there animal welfare groups in your area, volunteers? Is it a national animal response group that comes in and has authority? Who's responsible? Again, with this, there's no right or wrong answer. It looks different in different communities and different areas of the country, but it all comes down to the authority having jurisdiction. So here in Maine, the local community is responsible for sheltering. It's not us at the county, it's not the state, it's the local community. So it would be under them. A couple of examples, I know some towns handle sheltering on their own independently. Some have memorandums of understanding with a local animal shelter, so they handle it. So, again, many ways to do it. It's just figuring out who has the authority, who needs to be responsible, and what that looks like. Next slide. And then you're also going to want to think about planning in the way of who's responsible if you have a pre-planned incident, and then if you have an incident that pops up today. So if you are the authority having jurisdiction, let's say it's the local emergency management agency, that does not necessarily mean that they are going to be the lead agency. They may call in somebody from York County EMA to help, that we might call the state, we might call a national organization. So um, just because somebody does have the ability to make that decision and has the authority in that jurisdiction does not necessarily mean they need to be running animal sheltering, but they would need to delegate that authority. So you're going to determine who the lead agency is. If it's going to be your emergency management agency, if you are partnering with a local animal group, again, whatever that looks like, as long as you're following things the way they need to go in chain of command, then it's just fine. Um, so a lead agency, again, it's going to look different if we're saying, hey, we've got hurricane season right now. It typically gets busy this time. Busy in our area late summer, so we're starting to plan ahead now, versus saying, geez, we had something happen this afternoon, the skies are getting dark and we ended up needing to open a shelter. Determining that lead agency on the fly versus pre-planned may look different, but at the same time, you're going to ask the same questions: who needs to be there, who's responsible, how are you working together, what does planning look like long term, and then what needs to be done quickly in response to incidents. Next slide. And if it's the case, I think probably most folks here on this call are familiar, but if it's the case where we're kind of having something pop up quickly, and you're reaching out for help, this is generally how a resource request works. So an incident happens, the jurisdiction responds, they call in for support, and then the support comes. So kind of what we talked about already, with the authority having jurisdiction and how they may call in resources. Next slide. And then some general planning recommendations. This is pretty similar to any other sort of emergency planning. You're going to want to establish your objectives, roles, and responsibilities. Again, if you're doing it for a storm that's quickly coming this afternoon, that may look different than, hey, we're doing our shelter plan for the next 5 years. Um, Anticipating the duration of the response, obviously, that would be kind of a pop-up event. Determining how you're going to get resources, if you would need specialized resources or personnel, if you need, let's say, veterinary team and supplies, that may look different than just getting cots for sheltering. If you're responsible for housing responders, if you're calling folks in from other jurisdictions or volunteers, are they sleeping over? Are they going home? It would depend on the incident, of course, but kind of having a plan for that. Thinking about how you're working with the human shelter team, if you have a team, and what that might look like. And then how you're going to train your personnel long term, and then also a plan for just in time training. Looking at pre established relationships, whether that's with your local EMA, animal shelters, vets, animal control officers, kind of anybody that would fall under this. Do you need to have an MOU? And then looking at, any sort of legal or financial things you need to take care of ahead of time, and then having a pretty decent or at least basic understanding of animal shelter requirements and best practices. Next slide. And then once you have that, you kind of figure out who's in charge, who should be doing what, who will plan to do what, where you're going to get your resources, and kind of a general sense of your procedures. You're going to want to think about your site where you're actually going to have your shelter. So I know for most communities here in Maine and certainly York County, most of our places that we would house animals in an emergency would be right with the human shelter. So we do shelter surveys with each of the communities to find out where they're housing their humans, and then we set up a place for pets. So this is already pre-established. So if you asked me a town in York County, I could say, yep, here's where the shelter is, and yes, they have an area for pets. Is it enough? Probably not, but that's the way of sheltering. We have a certain percentage we work with, but at least having a baseline established, and then having other options that you could go to as well. So that's where working with local leaders and authorities would help, rather than kind of saying, hey, I'm from an animal group, or I'm from a volunteer group, and I want to determine this. You would perhaps work with your local EMA director or the fire chief, or whoever is going to be involved in this, because they're probably going to know their community and know where options either already exist or where you can add additional ones too. And this list here is just kind of some recommendations on things that make a good site for a shelter. This photo I took, that's actually during Hurricane Harvey. And I don't know if you're able to tell, but it's actually a parking lot or parking garage. So we set up kennels in an abandoned parking garage. So there were benefits there, and certainly, some cons as well, but it worked. And there's been many ridiculous places that we've opened shelters over time, which I'm happy to share at some point. But just basically having space to meet your needs. Things like, considering, would your residents be able to travel there? I know we talk about here in York County having more like regional type shelters, since it's a better use of resources. And then when we say, well, geez, somebody would have to travel 25 miles during a storm to get there, that's not looking so good. Um, is there access for the public? Is it near other locations? Can you get resources in? So again, all things to think about. Some examples of places that generally work for animal shelters if you're setting up in a place that's different than your co-located emergency shelter. Warehouses, empty buildings, community centers, those are all really good options for shelters no matter what community you're in. Next slide. And then once we've determined our plan, who's going to be there, what we're doing, where we're going, you're going to want to look on the inside. So, what is your shelter going to be like? This is, I used to work for the ASPCA. So, this is a blueprint of shelters that we and many other national organizations would use to set up a shelter. We typically go in some abandoned, usually disgusting warehouse and turn it into a shelter, which is a really kind of cool thing. So we would make these blueprints ahead of time, since it's not just a regular brick and mortar shelter. And you can see it's color coded, and there's room for storage, um, and a maternity area and a medical area and offices and all of this great stuff. So generally, however, for those who have done sheltering and are saying, oh my God, we do not have this blueprint, you're probably going to be in a room in a community center, or you're going to be in a room at the fire department, or you're going to be at the gym downtown in the bottom part of it. So this is kind of what I mean when you say ideally this would be pie in the sky, like we had a whole completely huge, wonderfully ventilated, perfect space for animals. And if you're in a closet down the hall somewhere, sometimes that's just the reality of sheltering, as many of us that have done it know. So work with what you can, but this would be ideal. So things to consider though, no matter how you're doing it, you're going to want to look at what species you have. Make sure you have airflow for them. Make sure there's room to put the airflow in the right direction so you're not blowing air from the isolation sick area to the puppy area. Room to expand. We might say, geez, we're looking to shelter 50 people and 30 dogs. And then all of a sudden you have 200 people show up with 150 animals. So is there room to expand? Can you control disease? Can you make sure that behavioral health and safety are accounted for? And then is it efficient? Again, this is kind of one of those ideal things, but if you're walking from one end of the building to the other and you figure how much time it takes to walk back and forth, you're adding time into cleaning. So if you're housing 4 dogs during a small winter storm here in Maine, probably not an issue. If we have a hurricane this season and we're housing several hundred animals, it could certainly become an issue. Next slide. So feel free to pop this in the chat, but what kind of sections would you include? If I said to you right now, we've got a storm coming, we've got a building, and I want you to go build a shelter. Any kind of sections. I see behavioral health for sure. Um, some other sections, and this, by the way, is my cat Annie. She's since passed on, but I certainly like that picture of her, and is a good conversation piece. So next slide. An exercise area. Yep. Exactly. So again, this is kind of a general shelter setup. You're going to have an area for registration. If you're running a shelter with humans, you might be registering pets and humans at the same time to save time. May be completely different. You're going to want a storage area, break area for the staff, offices, a medical area, a place to do medical exams, a general population area, an isolation area for sick animals, maternity area for pregnant or nursing dogs or animals, a quiet area for animals that need it, and then a decontamination area. Next slide. And again, all those areas may be in one room, so don't worry about it if that's the case. But one thing I wanted to talk about that's important, I clipped the blue squares from that larger blueprint that we saw a few slides ago. So a lot of people that do animal sheltering, emergency animal sheltering, use what's called a pod. There's different names for it. Sometimes you could say section or area or unit. It doesn't really matter, but pod is kind of a good word. And it's basically a designated separate section of cages. So you're going to have, when I say different sections, you would call those a pod. So the point of it, no matter what you're calling it, is that it's a dedicated space. You have dedicated personnel, supplies, and equipment. So this is a really good way to control disease. So if you're going from, one pod to the other pod, and you're bringing food and scoops, and you're scooping poop with one scoop and bringing it to the next pod, you're getting germs all over the shelter. So anybody that's done any sort of animal sheltering knows that that is an extremely crucial part of sheltering, is controlling disease, and that can help mitigate some of that. Behavioral health, you're kind of with your same pod mate, so the dogs ideally kind of somewhat get used to each other. You can clean more easily, and you can set it up any size or any shape. So it's a really good system. So if you look at this section, and let's look at pod F, let's say we had an outbreak of kennel cough, and we're going back and forth between each of these lettered pods, then now everybody has kennel cough versus we kind of kept it in pod F. And we isolated it that way. So it's not fail proof, but it is a really good system for ease of cleaning, behavioral health and controlling disease. Next slide. And then staffing. So as we're sitting here saying, okay, I'm either responsible for sheltering or I'm working with somebody that's responsible for sheltering, who's going to be working there? Um, this photo was from Hurricane Harvey. You can see many different organizations coming together, many of them national, some of them local. That was a significant disaster with many hundreds and hundreds and thousands of people and animals that needed sheltering. So yeah, national resources were called in, money was spent, time was spent. There was no, um, we did not hold back for that storm. But typically, what we're going to see is, maybe something like today. It's going to be, it's hot out. We most towns probably are not opening a cooling center today, but we certainly did a couple of weeks ago during the heat wave. Let's say we did need to house animals. Is it you? Am I going to be there? Do you have volunteers? Is it the fire department? Do you have a shelter team? So just things to think about. Ideally, you're going to think about what roles you need and then how many people you need. So it will depend on the length of the incident. If we're housing people and animals for 1 or 2 days, easy peasy, no big deal. But if we have a major storm and we're doing it for days, weeks, even months, that's certainly something to consider, that you would need staffing long term for that. A plan for number of personnel. If you have one person per 10 animals, you're doing pretty well. That's a good, safe number where you can be efficient and give dedicated time and care to animals. And also think about, where folks are coming from during emergencies. I've run into this many times. Here in York County, we have a great team, and then we call during an incident and it's an ice storm and people can't get out or they're afraid to leave or they're blocked in. So kind of think about that as well. You can have shelter teams. You can have cart teams. A lot of people here in York County have trained their municipal staff to work at shelters. So those are just some ideas that you can use. Bill, yes, you have a question.
Yeah, there's a question in chat. Can you
Yep.
explain what you mean by behavioral health for the pet shelter?
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks for catching that. So basically, we'll talk about this in a little bit in depth, but just meaning the basically the mental wellness of animals. So shelters are notoriously stressful places for animals with new smells and noises and people, not to mention just having come out of a potentially dangerous situation. And you kind of figure leaving that and then being placed in a cage with folks you don't know and other animals you don't know. Animals can demonstrate changes in behavior with that. So it's just a way to keep animals as mentally well as possible in a stressful situation. And we'll talk a lot more in depth in that in just a little bit. Great question. All right, next slide. Some ideas for assignments for staff. Again, if you have this going on, you are really, really in great shape. It's just some kind of ideas. You typically want to have a shelter lead. If you have a huge shelter, you'll want to have, somebody sitting at the shelter level and then somebody running the floor, and then a medical team and then a behavior team. And if you're doing anything that involves like cruelty, let's say, where you're opening a case, you might need some forensics or some evidence collection. You might be having folks register people, reunifying pets, facilities person. So again, I say I've done this presentation and some people sit here and they say, we have like 3 folks that come to our shelters. That's perfectly fine. People can wear many hats. And this would just be an example of a larger shelter, but wanted to introduce it in case you're in a situation where you do have to have several hundred animals or you do have a national organization come in to help. It's good to be familiar with this. Next slide. This is just a general org chart. Anybody that's done incident command system, ICS, this is one that would be used in a shelter situation. Again, there's probably, I don't know, maybe 20 roles here. You might be looking at 1 or 2. Next slide. And then you're going to want to think about training. So, we know where we might house pets. We know where we might design it. We have an idea of kind of who we want, what roles we're looking to fill. And then think about training. So long term and then and short term as well. So you're going to want to have different standard operating procedures, protocols. have regular training and exercise on those. Training in ICS, the Incident Command System, is always recommended if you're using that. I know we're biased in EMA. That's kind of all we do. First responders as well. We live and breathe by that. But it can be a really great training for folks responding, especially if it is a larger incident. And something to consider, especially in these smaller shelters, we might say, geez, we don't have, a team of 30 trained personnel that can do everything under the sun, but we do have four, like I said, municipal employees that they're free, they're here, they're ready to go. They need to be told what to do. So have something in place to have training on site, whether it's a manual or a person on site to orient people, give them a safety briefing, and then just kind of a just in time training. Here's what you need to know and here's how you do it, sort of thing. A combination of all of those things would be an ideal situation. And there's many SOPs and protocols and procedures and guidelines out there. So if you don't have any created, I can certainly connect you with some of those resources. So don't feel like you need to reinvent the wheel. Next slide. And things you would want procedures on. These are just some examples, how you would register people, how you would register pets, how you would feed pets, what you do if you have a loose animal, what do you do if somebody um, has a concern? What do you do if a dog does get a disease? We talked about a kennel cough outbreak. Do you call the vet? Do you have a vet? Are you able to give meds? Do you like who, what, where? So all of these things, these are just some examples, but definitely things you would want to include in your procedures. Next slide. And regardless of how you do things or who's doing them or what you're doing, what protocols and procedures you decide, they should all be guided by the five freedoms. This is something that we talk a lot about in animal welfare. It's basically freedom from hunger and thirst, discomfort, pain, injury, or disease, the ability to express normal behavior, and freedom from fear and distress. So, some of these things during an emergency situation may be. Uh, maybe not as much of a priority because you're working on life safety and things like that. But this is certainly um, something that every protocol and procedure and action you take in an emergency animal shelter should be doing it with these things in mind. Next slide. And there's also, we talked about laws at the beginning. There are also rules, laws, and best practices for sheltering day to day, and then also in an emergency setting. These are some good resources here. There's something that animal shelters use called the Standards of Care in Animal Shelters. It tells you everything you need to know, basically everything from what type of kennels you should use, how much space should be between food and the litter box, to what kind of medical care is adequate. There's also what laws that we have to follow here in Maine, and then guidelines just for best practices. So, um, a lot of this stuff, some of it kind of just comes together because it isn't an emergency situation, and some of the laws and rules and regs get thrown out the window during an emergency, as we know, and that happens with humans as well. Until you at least get your triage done and kind of like stabilization of an incident. But again, these are all things that certainly need to be incorporated into your practices. Next slide. All right, so we'll walk through basically the shelter. So we have everything planned out now, and we're kind of ready to go. We're opening our shelter this afternoon. So we register folks. That's an example of some paperwork that we use here in York County. But you can have registration paperwork however you would like it to be. Again, it can be done with the human shelter folks or not. Excuse me. You basically want to get um, whatever signatures and information you need on a registration form. An owner picture with the pet is always a good idea. If create a cage card, make sure that you have copies of all of your paperwork. Give a copy to the owner as well. You're going to want to take an inventory of the animal so you know where they are and keep a sheet of that. We usually put on a temporary collar, just like a tab band type plasticky collar with an ID number and or name or whatever you're using. Ideally, they would go see a vet and get triaged and examined and vaccinated, and then they would be put in their cage. So, again, if you're housing 5 dogs, in the cafeteria type area of the fire station during a power outage overnight, you're probably not going to have a vet. But if you're housing a large population of pets, certainly you would do that. Next slide. All right. And then day to day, our daily operations, ideally, this would be kind of who makes it up. So you'd have sheltering, a medical behavior team, logistics, safety, and then your human shelter staff would likely be people that are working on the team each day. Next slide. So sheltering, this is pretty much the main one. If you don't have folks doing behavior, that's very common. That's more, again, those several hundred animal shelters, or we have help from national organizations coming in. And a sheltering team usually consists of the manager, either a floor or pod lead, your daily care personnel. They're the ones that feed, clean, um, sometimes an enrichment coordinator. You might have other sections, but basically feed, cleaning, and exercising the animals is what the shelter team does. Next slide. If you have a medical team, they would triage animals, respond to any medical concerns, do exams, vets, meds, document evidence if that's needed. You might have that on site. You can see that's the same incident from before the Joplin tornado. There was a full medical team. I mean, there was probably 40 staff on the medical team. So that's perfectly fine in a shelter. Also, having just an MOU with a local vet where they can come in and do what you need to do legally and ethically, that's just as fine too. So, again, it's going to depend on the size of the incident and your community. Next slide. And then a behavior team. Again, this is probably not something most of us are going to see here at an emergency animal shelter, but there's A, ways to incorporate this into your daily care protocols, and B, it's again possible. If we had, like we said, my boss and I here, we always say we got the big one coming. You can ask Bill. We say it every year. The big one's coming, and it has not yet, but it will, and we will be housing animals that will require a full behavior team. So these are some of the things that they do, basically responding to behavioral health concerns. So that would just be stress, such, pacing, biting at the kennel, looking at ways to do specialized handling for any animals that may be a safety concern, evaluating behavior if they were going out for placement, different things like that. Next slide. And this is just an example of a kind of a day-to-day daily ops. I know there's, many ways to do this. Having this posted is always a good idea. I worked full-time for a national organization. I volunteered with several others. I've worked locally, and every single one basically follows the same thing. So you go in the morning, make sure everybody's accounted for and safe, feed them, track if they're eating, pooping, peeing, clean them, give them some quiet time, some afternoon projects, clean them one last time, and close up and leave for the day. So again, kind of a basic one, but one that's pretty well standard for most folks. Next slide. You're going to want to look at quarantine as well. I know this may be a little bit deep in the weeds for some of us here, and what our roles would be, but the long and the short of this is just make sure you're working with the vet in whatever capacity you need to. So if animals are, when they first come in and then when they're getting sick, that you're spending an appropriate amount of time quarantining them, either because it's a best practice or because it's a legal thing. Next slide. Thinking about PPE too, a normal operation, gloves and booties is usually fine. If an animal first comes in, you might have a Tyvek suit. This is a picture from an avian influenza outbreak in New York City. You can see the responders fully donning PPE. So there's many ways that you can be, or many levels of PPE, but normal glove and booty per pod, or changing gloves between animals, is generally perfectly fine. Next slide. And then cleaning, this is probably one of the biggest parts of animal sheltering. So again, we kind of talked about, depending on the shelter, some owners may do it. Our staff may be responsible for doing it. There's regular cleaning, there's spot cleaning, which is just a quick clean, and then there's a deep cleaning where you strip everything and clean it out. Um, for cats, usually kind of less is more with them. So spot cleaning usually works. And then with dogs, you're going to want to rotate them and get them out of the cage to clean, since they do tend to be a bit messier to clean than cats. Next slide. And then finally, decon. We mentioned that as part of a daily thing. This was set up here. I think that was the Joplin tornado. You can see some kennels, and they get dishes set up on there. You can read kind of the procedure there for doing it, but it's basically decontaminating items so that you are not spreading disease amongst the animals. Next slide. And then kennel signage, that's certainly an important thing of our day to day running a shelter. There's a million ways to do it, but it's really just putting all the information you need to know about an animal on the cage. So, shelters that folks like us would run, it's probably owner information, it might be their diet, it might be their handling level. So, if you can see on that picture, it's a little bit hard to see, but there's different colors on there that can indicate a handling level. Saying that, some animals may be more difficult to handle, so they need, a color designation. So when somebody's looking at the cage, they can know. If there's a dog, let's say, that only gets wet food, you would put that on the cage. So basically, before I go to open the cage, what do I need to know to be informed and safe? Next slide. And I mentioned the daily observation sheets before, so those are usually done twice a day. It's basically if the animal's eating, pooping, peeing, drinking. If whether you're housing just a couple animals in a community center or running a large shelter, you're going to want to know what's going on. If you have staff in and out every day, you might not know the animals by heart. If you have two cats, again, you probably know everything they're doing all day. But if you see that a cat hasn't eaten for 1 or 2 days, not really a big deal, but if you look at this form and you see that it's been 3 or more days, then you're starting to get concerned. So it's just a way to track things so everybody's safe and healthy. Next slide. And then if it is a larger shelter, since there's so many animals, having a concern board is a good idea. It's just a whiteboard you can place at the end of each pod where you would write the issues. And if you have a vet or behavior team going through, they go through and track this. Again, if you have 4 animals somewhere, you can probably just go tell somebody, but this is for participant. Bill, you got a question?
Yeah, we have a question in the chat.
Yep.
Do you usually require people to bring food for the animal to their bowls?
Um, for the owners to bring food for their pets. Is that the question?
Correct.
Yep. Not required, recommended, but not required. We usually do, as at the beginning, when we talked about what EMA does, some of the public outreach stuff would be saying if you're leaving for a shelter to bring your pet stuff, be completely self-sufficient. We also recognize that that's not always the case, or folks might not be able to do that. So we would provide that. But if people have food or if they have an animal on a special diet, that's also something where folks would want to bring their own food. All right, next slide. And then enrichment, this is just, we talked about behavioral health at the beginning. So shelters, again, are extremely, extremely stressful places for animals and humans, but particular animals. So enrichment is activities that we can provide to reduce that stress. In addition to stress, animals can get bored if you're just sitting in a cage all day and you're used to being, like not in a cage all day, you can get really bored. Quality of life can certainly decrease and quickly in a shelter. So, enrichment is things that we can do to not only to either increase and or decrease sensory stimulation in the shelter. So, um, there's if we had a large shelter, we would have a whole team doing enrichment, but this could be something that we could incorporate even if we had just a small number of animals. So you can see that's a chicken eating, I think, like an orange. I can't remember. But it can be something like just some quiet time, reading to a dog in the afternoon, spraying some scent so they can, have a minute to say, "Oh, that smells lovely." A toy. There's many ways to do it, and we could do a whole class on enrichment. But the long and the short of it is basically just to reduce stress in the shelter. Next slide. And then animal handling is another one. Again, this is we could do a several hour long class on animal handling, but it's important that this is part of folks' training procedures in their shelters. It does not have to be super extensive, but just having at least some basics on safe animal handling is a must. Um, Knowing, how to recognize stress in different animals, different species, and then how to respond. So these are kind of some basic things here. Again, we could get into a bunch of it, but as long as you know how to observe an animal, move slowly, have a basic idea on low stress handling techniques, have proper equipment, and especially training on that equipment. And then ideally, you would have designated handlers. So those would be people trained on and behavior that if a dog or cat was fractious, they would be able to respond in a way that's safe for the animal and the human. Next slide. And recognizing body language too, that's part of animal handling. So animals generally tell us kind of how they're feeling or what we need to know. We just need to know how to listen. This is one of those that's a bit nuanced and takes some finesse and some experience and some mistakes along the way. But again, many ways to do this and a lot of information about it. But the key takeaway for us is just knowing, moving slow, and then trusting your gut as we go along, which we'll do a practice of that here in just a bit. Next slide. And it's right here. So I'm going to ask you, we have not done any training on animal handling or body language. And I know there's a variety of probably handling level experience here in the room. But if we had our shelter this afternoon and I said, all right, go get this dog, grab your leash and go to town, um, not knowing anything about his, different types of things, what would you say just going by your gut and your observations? Would you touch this dog? Feel free to unmute or throw it in the chat.
Hello. Personally, I would say yes because his belly is exposed, which they only do that when they are extremely comfortable.
Sure, yeah. So I touch this dog. Yep, he's laying down. He's kind of relaxed. The other one, he's looking. His ears are kind of neutral. Eyes are big. Yep, I would touch this dog. Next slide. All right, same dog. What about now? No. Okay. I probably would, but I would approach this slowly and cautiously. You can see he's panting in one picture. He's giving a whale eye in the next. His ears are back in the next picture. So I would still proceed, but I would move very slowly. Next slide. All right. What about now? Who's touching this dog? Yeah, no, do not touch this dog. This is actually my dog, so I can confidently say you don't want to touch that dog. And you can see in the bottom two, those are actually my feet under the blanket that he likes to bite at night. So you can see he's leaning forward, his ears are back, his mouth is in a C shape. He's giving a cold, hard stare in the first picture. He's giving us all signs he does not want to be touched. So if this was a dog in our care, we did not go through a formal training, but everybody here just got 100% to say, yep, I trusted my gut. I watched what he was doing. um, and we probably would not touch this dog. So you're going to have to touch dogs in shelters. So at least having a basic understanding for your responders is key. So even if you put something up like this in your binder for just-in-time training, again, this is just to prove the point that you could have a whole behavioral health training and manners training um, and safety training, but just at least a basic understanding is certainly crucial to safety for everybody. Next slide. Next slide. All right. So a couple of types of housing, and we're not going to get into too many details on this, but just wanted to highlight for dog daily care. And I just did dogs and cats. We can talk another time about other types of animals, but you generally have two types of housing. So you have wire crates or what's called magnum kennels. I would say 99% of the time, especially for this group, we would be using housing on the left, just the wire crates. Next slide. Types of cleaners, there's many out there. There's good old fashioned bleach diluted with water. There's several hydrogen peroxide based ones now. It's up to you and your shelter what you're using. Just be sure to pick one or the other so you don't kill everybody on site with toxic fumes and have a hazmat incident. But again, part of your protocols and procedures. Next slide. We mentioned wanting to have a loose animal protocol. This would go for cats as well. Dogs seem to be riskier as far as getting out. These are just some basic ways that you would handle that. And I will send this presentation out after, so I won't cover every single detail on here, but having that protocol, knowing how to respond is absolutely crucial. Next slide. Same thing with dog fight protocol. The possibility if you have two dogs out at the same time, they would engage in a fight, sometimes through the kennel. So there's several ways to make sure that you can do this safely. This is certainly something that takes a lot of experience and skill. So if that is not you, there is absolutely no shame in saying that's not me and standing down and waiting for help to arrive, because it can be extremely dangerous for animals and people. Next slide. I won't go over this, but I'll send this out. This is basically just cleaning procedures for wire crates. Next slide. Same thing for Magnum. Next slide. Spot cleaning, so just quick cleaning. Basically, you go in, you pick up the poop and pee and fill things up, and that's good there. Next slide. And then feeding for dogs. So you can feed out of paper trays, metal bowls. Again, if owners bring bowls, that works too. If an owner has a special diet, or they say this dog gets a half a cup a day or whatever, you're welcome to follow that. It's up to the owners. If they're not there, then the vets would usually recommend, or there's a formula that's a pretty well accepted formula that folks can use as well. Sometimes there's special diets as well, and those can certainly be accounted for rather easily in an emergency animal shelter. Next slide. Those are the feeding amounts that I mentioned, so you can post those, and that's pretty easy there. Next slide. And then just some examples of enrichment. So it can be edible, toys, you can do different training. Walks would be enrichment, allowing an animal that we mentioned express its natural behaviors. So being able to dig or chew, um, things like music, or having a real life room. That's probably not something we would have at one of our shelters, but again, many ways that you can incorporate this as expensively and extensively as you would like. Or it could be something as just giving toys, putting treats in a toilet paper roll, so the dog has to take a minute to think about how to get to it. There's a whole range of enrichment activities, and again, we could do a whole class on this, but just a few ideas here. Next slide. And then for cats, same thing with the cleaners. That matches well with dogs. Next slide. And the same type of housing, again, we would see wire crates. We're likely not going to put owned animals in a group housing situation, but if we had a bunch of strays that came in and they were past their quarantine time, it can be beneficial for them to be in a group and move around. So a couple of options there, but generally we would just be using the individual wire crates. Next slide. This is part of those standards of care, how to lay out cat enclosures. So a couple of examples there. That would be easy to follow, but something to account for. And again, if we're setting up animals that had a life safety risk due to a natural disaster, and we have the bed or the blanket and food and water a little bit too close to the litter box, again, we don't have to fully adhere to all of this, but it is important to make sure that we are doing everything in accordance with not only the law, but what's right and what's healthy for animals. Next slide. Yep, you can go through the next couple of slides. This is just the cat cleaning. There's deep cleaning. And then, so for feeding, cats are especially susceptible to not eating in a shelter due to stress. So monitoring with those daily sheets, no matter what type you use, is extremely important. Again, recognizing stress in animals, that would be an example. So you might see a cat sleeping a lot. They feign sleep often when they're sick or stressed. Or if they're not eating, it's kind of like, oh, no big deal. But cats are extremely susceptible to stress, and not eating is usually one of the first signs. So very important to monitor and to know these things. Same thing, prescription diets, if they have special diets or if they have specific instructions from the owner, being able to accommodate that is important the best we can. Next slide. Same thing with enrichment. There's a few, variations based on the species, but it can again be as complicated or as simple as we want. Even just throwing some catnip down would be considered enrichment. Having vertical space is important, or a place to perch and hide. That's not only enrichment, but something that we would consider a cat's natural behavior, and a need for that. So, again, doing the best we can in these temporary emergency shelters, but also keeping in mind the best situation for wellness for pets. Next slide. And then, okay, so we're done now. We did our job. We saved all the pets. They're back with their owners. Maybe we got some left. We're ready to go home. So when it comes time to discharge, you're going to want to make sure you're actually sending the right pet home with the right person, which is where the photos and the paperwork and the IDs come in. You're going to look for any notes or concerns that need to be shared. If you said, oh, geez, the dog's developed diarrhea while he was here, you should follow up with your vet. Or, oh, your cat, bit the crap out of somebody, whatever the case may be, you'll want to share that with owners. Returning any thing that they brought in, making sure your paperwork and inventory is marked. And then again, if this is a case where pets aren't going home with their owners and they need to be adopted, euthanized, or anything like that, you would work with the appropriate agency to help you do that. And then if there are resources or referrals needed, either to vets or um, anything else, a spay neuter clinic or anything that can be made as well. We decon their cage and either break it down or get it ready for the next animal to come in. Next slide. When we talk about demobilization, that includes the entire operation. So let's say we get all the pets out, or we at least have a plan to discharge them. You're basically pulling resources out of the field at that point, returning to baseline operations. That's demobilization. So, um, anybody know when you start planning for demobilization? When a good time for that would be?
In the beginning?
Immediately. Yep, you guys get it. Exactly. So as soon as we open that shelter, we should be making a plan to close it. Um, exactly. So determining who makes that call. Is it the shelter staff? Is it the incident commander? Is it the EMA? Again, no right or wrong answer, but just making sure you have that established. If you have a certain threshold for triggering demobilization, saying, okay, we have, 2% of the shelter, humans and pets left, or is it when we enter recovery? Is it when first responders stop responding to the immediate incident? Like, what's the threshold? And then situational awareness, like, just because everything's wrapping up at our shelter might not mean that down the road at, Bill's shelter, things are not still going hot and heavy there. Not that we have other considerations. So just maintaining contact with the EOC or whoever's coordinating the incident is critical in communicating that. And then this is just on the right here is an excerpt from a kind of a general demobilization plan. Some of the ICS incident command stuff we talked about would list out different sections having specific responsibilities. So you can either follow that or kind of change that to meet your own needs. Next slide. And then as things go on long term, you're gonna not only are you, saying, okay, is everybody set and ready to go? You're gonna want to get your inventory, your resources inventoried, equipment, finance and admin usually kicks in really significantly at this point. And then you look at longer term recovery. So again, if we open a shelter for a couple of days here in Maine, it's probably not a big deal. But if we have a major incident, or even without, we've had to open disaster recovery centers where folks can get resources. Sometimes communities need to be rebuilt, or you're looking at, assistance from FEMA, either for public infrastructure or individuals, and that can last for several years and be very challenging even for smaller events. So you have immediate demobilization, but also your recovery can go long term as well. Next slide. And then usually you're going to want to do a review of the incident. So if we wrap things up this afternoon, it would serve us well to do what we call a hot wash. So where we'd all sit around either as the whole agency or the whole incident or just the shelter. And we basically just say, we go around informally like these folks are doing here in the picture. What went well, what didn't, and how can we fix it? Were there any major concerns? And then once that is done, usually a week or so down the road, we would do a more formal review of that to say, okay, next time when we open up a pet shelter, we need to make sure, yes, that it was mentioned earlier, we need to communicate to owners to bring food, or we need to work better with the EMA, or whatever the case may be. We didn't actually have a really good plan for discharge. So we're going to look to, develop a relationship with the local animal group, whatever the case may be. And that gets documented and you make a plan for improvements for next time. And then if it's something that's particularly either traumatic or involves first responders use this model a lot, critical incident stress management and debriefing during highly stressful or traumatic situations. That can be something that we would involve as well for responder mental health. Next slide. So we covered a lot of things and rather quickly. So hopefully you were able to take at least a few key points away from this, but I highlighted what I thought were the takeaways, and we'll be interested if anybody has a need to share after. But you're going to want to look at pre-planning and training ahead of time. That's extremely important. Have a solid understanding of roles, responsibilities, who the key players should be, and how all of those things fit together. Not only animal shelter training, but emergency management training or incident command system training. Looking at building relationships. If you're responsible for pet sheltering, you would probably want to build a relationship with some pet people, vets or shelters. And if you're vets or shelters, you probably want to build a relationship with some incident folks or emergency response folks, first responders or EMA, and others as well. There's many people that involved in this in the community. You're going to want to establish those procedures and training ahead of time and think about where you're getting people, staff, equipment, supplies. Understand some of those animal sheltering guidelines and best practices. You don't have to be an expert by any means, but at least the basic things to keep not only responders safe and healthy, but animals as well. And then recognizing things like stress in animals and responders goes along with that as well. And then continuous improvement. So if you leave here today and you say, holy crap, we have absolutely nothing in our community ready to go for sheltering, that would be a way to improve. You would have now a list to say, okay, here's some places we could start. Or if you open a shelter in a couple of weeks and you say, geez, here's a lot of things we found we could improve upon. If you're taking steps to do that, that's perfectly great. Again, if you take everything in this presentation and you're doing it, I would say you're probably a rarity. If you're doing some of this stuff, I think that's great as long as you have a plan for looking at what you would do in different situations and building from there. Next slide. And then if you have any, some of the things we talked about was public outreach and education. If you're interested, please follow us on social media. We have Facebook, X, and Instagram. We do some pet preparedness stuff on there as well that you're welcome to learn from and or steal. So please scan the QR code or look us up on either one of those platforms and like and follow us. Next slide. And then that's my contact information. I know we touched upon many, many things, and we could make several classes out of this. I know we have several different levels of experience and involvement with shelters. So if there's anything that comes up, big, small, or in between, please reach out to me. Or if you have questions that pop up along the way after, I'm always available and happy to assist with you. So if anybody has any questions, please feel free to ask. And aside from that, I really appreciate everybody being here. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Megan. I want to encourage you. Megan's a tremendous resource. So anything regarding pet sheltering, she is our main expert and has, like she shared, she has some great best practices that are very valuable. More and more, the importance of thinking about pets, they're part of the family. With that, anybody have any questions they'd like to ask Megan before we leave? Well, with that, I do want to thank Megan for her time and her dedication to this. Professionalism is always um, a very important thing, and I think the information is very helpful. I will try to get the presentation sent out to everybody tomorrow. I think we can get it downloaded and we'll try that. And I do apologize for our challenges. I also want to let you know we do have a monthly VOAD training session every month. The third Tuesday at 3 o'clock through Microsoft Teams. And I actually put in the chat the actual link to attend that. And I want to encourage you to join us as we talk about our next session is going to be on Maine VOAD rules of engagement. A very good